Good evening, everyone, and sorry about being a little bit tardy tonight. We've had some technical difficulties yet again, but welcome to this evening's edition of MANstream Media, a place where you're going to get the male-friendly version of the news and the issues. Tonight we're going to be talking about boys, and Warren Farrell gave an address in Detroit at the AVFM conference that was on the 10 issues that men face. And one of the things that Warren did was he looked at what is going to be the best way to put things forward. What is going to be our best way to start changing minds? Because it is a huge, huge task we have to try and get men's issues on the table. And so Warren really talked beautifully about how our best stance is to start thinking about boys. And maybe we can start there. I guess we need to welcome people first. Warren Farrell is here. Of course, he's the author of Myth of Male Power and a number of other fine men's books. And Paul Elam's also with us. Paul, founder of AVFM. Say hello, Paul.
I just did. I said hi, everybody.
Oh, I didn't hear it. So anyway, we're going to talk about boys tonight. And Warren, why don't you go on and start us off?
First of all, let me give maybe a little bit of an overview of what the 10 issues are, so we have a sense as to or what 10 issues are that I put forward, and the whole invitation is that the AVFM community can chime in, add to those issues, say alternatively, this issue is not really that important, or at least not as important the issue that I'm thinking of right here. So I'll explain in a few moments why the boy crisis is such a crucial issue and why I think it's a good lead-off issue. And then a second is, many people say, what's the most important cause of the boy crisis? And I think it's the father absence, or put another way, children's need for both parents and what happens when that doesn't occur. And then the third is the pay gap issue, and that's because so many people feel that's a quintessential example of men sort of owning the workplace and discriminating against women, and an example of men using power to their own benefit, and explaining why that is not the case. And fourth is communication, and communication is so key because no matter what we understand, if we can't hear each other, nothing in the world will work. So we all should develop communication skills that are really, maybe the only model for it is the way the Israelis and the Arabs listen so carefully to each other. So I'm obviously being facetious, but that's just an example of the way communication skills are worldwide in need of all of our attention. And the fifth would be men's. I saw Tom looking like, what? I must be kidding. And the answer is, I am kidding.
He was chuckling.
Another area is men's studies, and that's because in part, there's 150,000 per year that in college go through women's studies programs, and a very high percentage of the people in the media or in human resources and companies that deal with male-female issues have been through women's studies programs or graduated from women's studies programs. That's part of their qualifications to deal with gender. And yet they're the group, as a rule, as we'll talk about, that understands the least about men of any other group in the population. Control pill. We understood that the women's pill was something that probably changed society more than any other single thing, and changed women's options. But men don't have a pill, and we'll share more about why that's extremely viable scientifically, and what's needed to actually bring it about. The next is the men's health intelligence. We'll talk about how every single thing that it took to make the world healthy was exactly the things that it took to make men disposable, and therefore unhealthy psychologically and unhealthy physically, and why that needs to be reversed. And then we'll look at some institutional structures as the seventh possible issue of a White House Council on Boys and Men, and perhaps I'll deal a little bit with that tonight and why that's so crucial. And then ninth is the issue of male disposability and how that haunts our consciousness, and how almost no one understands it, and how until we deal with it, men's issues will never be an issue that we are able to face, and getting our sons to have a real level playing field in life will never be possible. And 10th is male image. The image of men is disastrous at the present moment, and the image of boys is disastrous, but especially men and fathers. And so we'll look at what can be done to change that. And of course, the first step in changing an image problem is recognizing that there is an image problem. And so those are some of the things that all three of us will be discussing over the course of the next number of sessions that we do together. Okay, so the boy crisis. So there is maybe 5 significant areas where the boy crisis manifests itself. In education, I'd say the single most important one is that this is the first time in American history in which our sons have less education than their dads. And when boys have less education than their fathers, that used to be a disaster. But in the old days, if a boy didn't have a lot of education, he could go into manufacturing, he could go into construction, he can go into going under a car and being a mechanic. There was a fair amount of muscle that was needed in the old days. In the future, it will be less about muscle and more about microchip, less about muscle and more about mental. And but there's a lot of possibility there for boys, which is that the education system right now is not oriented toward vocational education. So in Japan, where the education system is, for example, oriented much more toward vocational education, those boys who are not academic can get signed up into a vocation. So, for example, if they sign up for welding, welding takes things like physics and takes things like chemistry to learn, and we now know enough about boys to know that if boys have a goal, like they will be a welder, they'll learn chemistry, they'll learn physics. But if boys are just learning chemistry and physics in the abstract, their mind tends to wander, they don't see a purpose in it. So boys' brains are wired to take theory and apply it, go into application. This is not just theory about boys. This is actual what is wired in the brain of boys, and so so it's so crucial that if boys aren't like I was as a boy. I imagine Tom was as a boy. I don't know about you, Paul, but I was sort of very academically oriented, and I know Tom, you have much more of a. I mean, Paul, you've had so many lives. I'm never sure which one manifested at an early age, rather than being from a truck driver to an academic counselor. Were you academic as a boy, Paul?
Yes, primarily so. I would be considered more in the nerd class than in the jock class by far.
Yes. Well, you're so tall, and I thought maybe you were a basketball player or something also.
No, but they asked me a lot.
I imagine they did. So let's see. So education is, as we've all heard many times, education is set up very well for a girl to be effective. Girls tend to listen to a greater degree. They love taking notes. They're much more. It's user friendly for a girl to say what she learned and without questioning it. It's more friendly for boys to have a lot of recess, have a lot of physical activity, to have a lot of stimulus, and so some of this is being learned in schools now. But the fear, the litigation, the litigiousness, the fear of litigation in schools is making people very fearful of having rough activities on the playground, and a boy calling another boy a name is now called bullying. Well, there's a lot of value to examining bullying, but it's also a lot of value to not have that go so far that a boy can't say what his real feelings are and act out and learn to handle criticism and learn to handle teasing. So these are things that have to be re-examined in the education system in order to help boys really feel good about being in school and translating their tendency, if they're not academic, to want things to be practical for them, and having that be more in the school system. And obviously things like getting more male teachers in schools would be helpful, and of course getting fathers at home so that the male modality is more acceptable as a boy sees a role model that he can work with. The second area that overlaps with education is jobs, and I gave a few hints as I was talking about education about how many aspects of our society is going to be changing so that boys are needed in areas like robotics and areas like computers, but also in areas that are typically considered female jobs. In programs around the country, in education programs, preparing boys and girls for teaching in elementary school, the program, there are 9 girls signed up for programs for each one boy that is signed up to be a future elementary school teacher. And so many children in our inner cities, especially boys, they go from a home that is female dominated to a school that is female dominated. And oftentimes then we say in an inner city, I wonder why a boy is attracted to a gang leader as a role model when he has no constructive role model prior to that gang leader. And so it all makes so much common sense, but if we don't have boys learning an alternative mission, a way of feeling that they have something to contribute, then they don't feel that they have constructive energy. When boys' energy is not channeled constructively, it is the most destructive energy in the planet. When it's channeled constructively, boys go on a mission to contribute and to be constructive, and we have a much better world for that. So a third aspect, component of the boy crisis is fatherlessness, and probably the scariest single statistic that I'm aware of in terms of its implication for our future is that as of last year, women who had children who were under 30, 53% of them had children without being married. By itself, that's not a disaster, but it's a disaster because when a woman has a child without being married, very rarely does the father get involved. And when he does get involved, he gets involved in a hierarchical type of way, that he gets involved to the degree that the mother allows him to be involved, and that's when the decision about that is made. If the father fathers the way a mother feels a father should father, then the mother allows the father to be involved as a father. But the father oftentimes complains about being gatekept and being told what to do when he's seeing the child and how to do it and what's wrong, and if there's too much teasing or there's too much roughhousing, or the child is taken to an area that the mother deems dangerous or allowed to go to a playground alone and gets into a fight, the mother then condemns the father very frequently as being not adequately attentive to the boy's protectiveness. And it's only usually when there's a mother and father in the home together and they're sort of arguing with each other about how much protection and how much lack of protection, does the child have a chance to get a balance between protection and lack of protection. And lack of protection is helpful. Obviously, protection has to occur, but lack of protection is, what I mean by lack of protection is being able to have an opportunity to take risks, to maybe get into a pickup sport, like in basketball on a playground, and then during that sport maybe they get into an argument with each other, and maybe there's even a pushing and shoving that occurs. And even if the boy is hit, he comes home to the father, and the father says, okay, how could you have done that differently? Could you have chosen a different type of boy? Did you have a sense that he was going to be rough with you to begin with? When could you have exited that situation? So a father's attitude is very frequently to allow a boy some leeway to get involved with activities and behaviors that can be less than perfect in its protectiveness, so that the child can learn how to protect himself when he is still in the parent's care, as opposed to being overprotected while he's growing up, and then suddenly cast into life without any experience of how to build that bridge to protectiveness. Those are just a few things that we're learning about fathers. The most important thing is, I think, that to know about fathering is that children that have a significant amount of father involvement do better in more than 30 different areas of child development. All the emotional areas, the social areas, the physical health areas like not being sick, and also academic areas. And so the involvement of fathers from the day that a child is born, and really even during the months of pregnancy, is a really crucial ingredient that is being left out. That will, as long as we don't address that, we will have problems that we will be dealing with for the next generation or two. Next to last is the physical health. We have a situation where most people think that, oh, women just naturally live longer than men. That's biologically part of it, so there's no big difference and no big deal. Very few people realize that in the United States in 1920, women lived 1 year longer than men, not 7 years like was true a few years ago, not 5 years like is true now, but 1 year longer than men. Today, women live 5 years longer than men. Men die earlier of 14 out of the top 15 leading causes of death, and yet there is no federal office of men's health and 7 federal offices of women's health. And so we have to address, why do we care so little about men's health? Why do we send men off to death, and then when they come back, we don't have adequate rehabilitation systems? We spend only a fraction on rehabilitating men who have been in combat and women who have been in combat, but 26 out of 27 people killed in war today are still men. 26 out of 27 are still men, even though 12% of the military is women. And so and when they come back from the military, we don't do the psychological training to deal with the post-traumatic stress syndrome that is anywhere near what it needs to be to have a healthy man re-enter the society. And last is the emotional health. And I was mentioning at the outset that every single thing that men learned to do to keep the society healthy in order to go to war, when something was bothering us, our response to something bothering us is, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. That is extremely functional for getting something done. But it is not extremely functional for handling the feelings that are inside of yourself. You learn over the course of your lifetime to sort of repress those feelings in order to be impressive, rather than to express those feelings that are helpful to express, save the feelings that are not helpful to express at that given point in time, know how to compartmentalize something when it's not appropriate, but then know how to uncompartmentalize it, take it out, and share it when it is appropriate. We haven't taught people, like Tom Goldwyn does, as to how to acknowledge and recognize a different type of way of dealing with men's feelings. So this is a whole different area of creating the entrance into emotional health that is fundamentally not part of male training historically. And so the reason I suggest starting as the #1 issue to be boys' issues is because I have found over the years of speaking on men's and boys' issues that when I'm speaking about problems that adult men face, women cringe. As soon as I change the exact same problem to a problem that her son faces, women open up and they want to know more information. Almost every man's issue starts in some small form as a boy's issue. But presented as a boy's issue, women want to know about it. Dads want to know about it. Educators, who are often usually female-oriented, they want to know about it. So the most resistant portions of the population open their hearts to boys. And so men's issues need to be fed through a receptive funnel if we're going to be successful politically and emotionally and bring the family back together in the future, in my opinion. That was long. You guys, take over for a while.
Long but good.
It was good.
Yeah, and we are in a tricky state now with the whole thing. And I agree with you, Warren, that people are more likely to open up to the issues of boys. But I think it also needs to be said that even boys' issues are not that gripping for people. When you talk about boys' issues in legislatures for the school stuff, they kind of go, oh, well, big deal. That's not whereas you talk about girls' issues, like, oh, let's get something done. You know, so even with boys' issues, there's this gynocentric piece that kind of keeps the boys down here and the men down here. And people have a very hard time hearing it.
Yeah.
You know, when you're talking about the men in pain too, I was thinking that the reason men don't open up is because no one wants to hear it. Nobody. I mean, who's going to go around and open up when everyone's, you know, just, oh, what an idiot. You know, men are not going to open up.
My teddy bear likes to hear it.
What's that?
My teddy bear likes to hear it.
That's about right. You know, that's about right, and that is why solitude for men oftentimes is one of their best friends. You know, we can process when we're alone, when we're in solitude, so much. You know, and because the other times people don't want to hear the crap. But back to boys, you know, the whole boy issue is so critical because it is our little inch in there. It is our way to kind of connect in and get people feeling about these issues. Because you're right, when men talk about their issues, no one wants to hear it. You're out of there. What do you think, Mr. Elam?
I think men need to learn to not care whether anyone wants to hear it or not. That's what I honestly think.
Yeah.
I think the only solution that there really is, because you're right, Tom, and Warren has written about this extensively, we live in a culture that is indifferent to the pain and experience of men and boys, largely, and a culture that's even hostile to the expression of those problems and those pain. We've seen it in riots. We've seen it in death threats against people who try to speak to these issues. I mean, there is a lot of hostility, a lot of pressure, and I think the answer is men that don't care about the resistance. And unfortunately, and I guess it's fortunate in one way, that resistance is being bred because the level of indifference and hostility to men's feelings is getting so out of control and to a point that it's no longer, it doesn't even seem to follow the natural order of things. But I want to go back for a minute and talk about boys, because a lot occurred to me as Warren was speaking, and particularly where he was talking about 9 out of 10 people with the hopes of becoming elementary school teachers being female, and where he talked about the single mother households. What our boys are missing more than anything else, in my opinion, is that they are growing up in the absence of mature masculinity. It is almost non-existent. Now, I remember growing up, my father was in the military, but mostly he was there. You know, he did go on tours and he went to combat. He was an advisor in Vietnam, so we missed him from the home for that period of time. But for a lot of the time, we were stationed on the base with him, and he came home after work every day and was home on the weekends. And we had him there, and I had uncles, and there were male school teachers in my elementary school. And then later in middle and high schools, there were a lot of male coaches and a lot of male teachers, a lot of male influence. And the same thing went on in college. I grew up with role models around me all the time, and there were bad role models and there were good role models, but I was so connected to them that I had choices of what I wanted to emulate, and I had people giving me guidance on what to do. And now we live in a culture where men are literally terrified to even touch children. They're scared of what people will think, and we see this in some ways as unfair to the men, and it is really unfair to them. But think of the child in this, where the males in the presence in their lives are withdrawn from them, who won't photograph them, who won't go to the park with them, we have airlines now that won't allow a male to sit next to an unescorted child on a plane. Air New Zealand's that way. Qantas is that way. There's British Airways, as far as I know. And there have been lawsuits filed over this. But we have grown into a culture that seeks to isolate mature masculinity from our boys. And so they are left rudderless in their lives. It's no wonder. And then they get into an elementary school system that is geared only for girls, for the most part. It's what they care about. The way that learning is perceived is the way that they perceive girls learning, and boys need to adapt to that. and their playfulness, their physicality is discounted in favor of doing things in a more feminine way. And so what we've done is we're not only taking them away from the role model of masculinity, but we begin separating them from their own masculinity very early. We do that in single mother households, and then we do it more in primary education when they first go in. The message is literally that boys are bad and that girls are good. This is why we see posters that boys are stupid, throw rocks at them, and they're geared for children to see these things and to find them appealing. And girls rule, boys drool. These social messages over and over and over again about the inadequacy of boys and separating them from healthy masculine influence, I think is damaging them greatly. I think that if you want to look at the causation, and it's only speculation on my part, I don't have the hard evidence to back it up, but if I was to guess at the causation of why we're seeing young men fail to get to college so often and fail to even show up and try, it's because that they have been absolutely discouraged from trying from seeing themselves as valuable human beings. They're taught to see themselves as flawed all the way up. They're taught that there's something inherently wrong with masculinity, and instead of, go invent and go explore and go, find your piece of the world and take it like we used to, like I was taught when I was raised up. What we're telling boys is check your privilege and sit down and be quiet. And we live in a rape culture. Yeah. And you need to do something about it because you're responsible. And women have been oppressed through a patriarchal system for year after year after year, and you're a part of that, so you need to check your privilege. I mean, we're getting to the point now that this feels to me, and I know I'm not usually quick to invoke Godwin's law, but this feels like 1936 Berlin. It does. There's a flavor of this that is so unsettling to me, that we have so commonly come to discriminate against men. I saw a T-shirt the other day that said, "Sure, men have feelings, but who cares?" And that's something.
Wow.
And that's something that a woman was wearing proudly. She thought it was funny. And we have hashtags, kill all men, and we have Jessica Valenti wearing a T-shirt that says, "I bathe in male tears." And this stuff is horrendously popular. So we're damaging our boys with this. We are literally destroying their opportunity. And to cap it all off, and some people say don't go there. Yes, I'm going to go there. With many of our boys in this culture, we begin their life. We were talking about the other day when I was talking to Warren. I said we could talk for an hour easily on the first 10 minutes of a boy's life. That when you look at what comes from, historically, from what the gender expectations of men to the political climate of today, there's a million things you could discuss that are already going on by the time a boy is born. But one of the first things we do with so many boys in this culture is sexually mutilate them. We cut away, usually without anesthetic, in an event so traumatic that I know that it elevates. There's chemical properties in the brain that are a reaction to stress and pain. And I know, and I forget the name of them, but I know that the levels of those chemicals remain high for 6 months after a genital, I'm not going to call it circumcision, after a genital mutilation. Those chemicals remain at spiked, peaked levels for up to 6 months after the event. And I was talking to somebody recently about people regressing and going back to early childhood memories and remembering the pain and the agony and the torturous experience of circumcision. This is how we introduce young men to the world. And then we do the same thing. We emotionally circumcise day in and day out and day in and day out, and to the point now that we live in a culture where people are watching young men fall out of education, fall out of employment, experience so many problems at levels significantly more than women do, and people still aren't even asking why in any realistic way, not for the most part. So I think that separating boys from that external sense of masculinity, from that role model, from that sense of being valued and mentored, is one of the greatest damages that we've ever done to them. We've taken their rudder away in life, and then when they get older and go wayward, then we say, look at that, men are bad.
Yep.
And it's absolutely an insanity of the times in this culture. I don't have a clue where to start it, but I believe that people like Warren Farrell do know what we need to do. And I think it's really important that we figure out a way to stop, to get society to listen. I'm going to say one more thing. Now, I've talked a long time. This is why, and I want to explain again for people that don't understand. I get a lot of questions from people about, why the intense hyperbole, why the stridency, Paul, the bombast. Why do you do all that? I do it for a reason. We are in a cultural coma where it concerns the issues of men and boys. And I mean, you can take these issues and some of these statistics that we're talking about, an 11-10 or 11-1 suicide rate during divorce for men, the incidence of alcoholism, everything else being much greater, certain kinds of depression. And, we have 25 veterans committing suicide a day. We have boys falling out of education. I mean, everywhere you look, there's some really alarming statistics in a culture that is not at all alarmed. And that is, if somebody doesn't get loud, and I invite any of my critics for being too boisterous or too strident in this or too offensive, that if you've got another way, please, show me. I really want to see it. But I don't think we will get there until some people are grabbed by the collars and rattled a little bit. But I don't mean, of course, that literally. But I mean, until we begin to shake the complacency out of the society around us, until we have enough men and women standing up and saying, this culture will not ignore these issues anymore because we are going to keep making noise until something starts to happen. And I believe that's the only way we'll get there anymore, because so far we've gone from difficult with men and boys. I mean, it was always difficult. We've never been given credit for that, to the point that it's sheer insanity that even speaking publicly, we're doing here and now. There are people that hate us intensely for even having this conversation about these issues. And these are people in positions of power and influence. As Warren said, throughout the media, the women's studies graduates basically infiltrating the fields of psychology and media and governance. And that is what we are facing with people that are severely hostile to this. And the only way I think it's going to change is for people to find some and to stand up and say it is going to change, and inspire hopefully many, many other people to stand up and say we are not going to forsake our boys anymore. And that's me on my soapbox, and I'm done with that.
I like the soapbox. I like it.
Good word.
I think that you're right. The circumcision issue is key. Because if you allow people to cut the most sensitive part of a boy's body right after he's born, I mean, that's just bizarre. That's beyond the beyond. And I was thinking about this the other day. When little infant boys go in to get circumcised, they obviously have to hold the penis, move the penis, get it associated, get this and that. So he's obviously being stimulated. He's thinking, oh, this is good. Then all of a sudden, wham! It gets cut. It's like, wait a minute, what happened? And I feel strongly that this sets up a PTSD kind of reaction in men who've been circumcised, where sexual stimulus tenses them up. We get tense, we get tight. Because why? Because that first memory when someone stimulated you and it felt really good, all of a sudden, out of no place, you hurt like you've never hurt before and probably never have since. I mean, and if we can allow that kind of thing to happen to little infant boys, I mean, what kind of culture are we? That's just crazy. My kids grew up in the 80s. I had a son and a daughter, And it really gave me a viewpoint that I guess some other people may not get, and that is to see the comparisons between the way my son was treated in schools and the way my daughter was treated in schools.
Mm.
And I'm telling you, my daughter got opportunity after opportunity after opportunity with special this, special class for this, special opportunity weekend to do this, gifted and talented this and that and the other. My son was just as bright as my daughter. He got almost nothing. Nothing. And it was mind-blowing to me to watch this happen. But I also know that what he did get was he got shamed for being male. And he and his friends knew, gosh, he had some of the most intelligent, beautiful friends. These boys were genius material. They were really, really bright. And guess what? A lot of them have had a very hard time because they have not gotten the opportunities. They've not, I mean, people need to see, wow, this kid's a genius. He's really got something here. Let's help him out. Let's get him to this or that kind of opportunity. Nothing. I see these young men now who are not doing much. You know, and they are brilliant. These are brilliant young men. I know some of their IQs, and they're way up there. So, yeah, we're not treating our boys very well at all, and it's heartbreaking because people simply don't see it. Men have everything, and the pain of men is just not what you talk about. So, so where do we go with all this? What do we do about it?
I think there's a couple of ways. First of all, Paul, I think you were saying, like, you know, it's important for us not to care, and it would sound like from what I said at the beginning when I was talking about we have to move through, you know, boys' issues should be our number one issue because after all we can get people to care. So is there a contradiction between what you're saying and what I'm saying? I want to be really clear that I see zero contradiction. I think that to make change, social change, multiple methods of it takes people who do not care. It takes people willing to say anything and not worry about what they're losing. And it also takes people to move through the most strategically careful and cautious ways and penetrate where it can be penetrated. All of that needs to happen. Yes. And so if you're listening, you look at the type of personality you are. You know, are you somebody who wants to get out there and demonstrate? Are you somebody who is okay with sort of saying what you really feel and whatever comes back, you have that type of personality that you can handle that? Or are you somebody that maybe wants to be an educator and would like to teach boys in school and you have the organizational capability to start a school that is very sensitive to taking advantage of the things and the ways that boys learn and standing up for that? So there is room for everyone here. Are you just a great writer and you don't want to be bothered from your room? You just want to write about these things and think about these things. And there is in every social change, there are multiple paths for multiple personalities. And so tap into the one that works for you and do not put down the people who are different from you. We did a recent NPR program and I was being interviewed. And they asked 4 different questions as to try to bait me into putting down ABFM, A Voice for Men, and Paul Elam, and the ways that the types of methods that Paul said. And I said, listen, you know, if you can give me something that A Voice for Men has done that is worse than when we were on the board of Now. And there was Valerie Solanas' book called The Scum Manifesto, The Society for Cutting Up Men. And this is by an author, Valerie Solanas, who ended up shooting Andy Warhol. So this was not just a theoretical book. This is a woman who was dangerous. And, you know, and if you can give me a parallel example to that, we'll have a discussion about this. But the truth is that any movement at the beginning has people who are angry, and anger is vulnerability is masked, and you need to sort of hear the vulnerability behind all anger. And if you hear someone's vulnerability, they will feel heard, they will feel much more willing to and able to work with you. Men are crying out today in all sorts of ways because we don't feel heard, and it's a step evolutionarily in the right direction to just express feelings, whether it's anger or not. It's said oftentimes that men had permission to express anger. Not to women, they didn't. When a man expressed anger to women, that was not okay. Anger was okay as a feeling for men to express toward other men, just like it was okay for men to kill other men, but not otherwise. So that's issue one that I really want to clarify, because many people will say, well, Warren disagrees with Paul on these issues. I think that, as I said, there's multiple ways. Second is Paul is talking about mature masculinity, and how do we create that? And so let me give some examples of why a father's involvement is so important. First of all, we know from studies all over the world that the more a father is involved, the more a child is likely to be empathetic, both girl children and boy children. Now, you don't usually associate empathy with a man. We know that empathy, by most measures, is slightly greater from females than males. But very few people realize that children don't become empathetic by being always empathized with. They become empathetic by having to think of someone other than themselves. And a father oftentimes will, let's say the father is roughhousing with a child. First of all, the mother will not be likely to be nearly as likely to be roughhousing with a child, and the child will maybe poke the father or kick the father or pull the father's hair, and the father will say something like, "Excuse me, you can't do that. You have to do it this way. I have to be thought of too. There are certain rules that are okay. There are certain rules that aren't. I have needs, and I cannot be poked and have my eyes picked in order for you to win." And so then the child always does what a child does, which is test the boundaries. And the child will next time do it again and do the same hitting, kicking, or whatever. And the father will much more likely say, "Okay, you chose to continue the behavior that was not what I asked you to do. That's the end of wrestling." And if the child goes, "Oh, you're just so bad," well, you can continue complaining, and there'll be no wrestling tomorrow night either. And so the child learns after a while that it has to think of someone other than himself or herself. And so that's an example of how empathy begins. Now, one can say there's different reasons and different examples, but what we know for sure, that whatever the reasons are, that the more exposure children, not just in U.S. culture, but in all cultures that have been studied, the more exposure to fathers that children have, the more likely they are to be empathetic. Well, we say then, well, wait a minute, the child's roughhousing. Isn't that child learning to be aggressive? No, that child's actually learning how to be assertive. On what basis do I say that? The data shows that the more children do things like roughhousing with fathers, the more they learn how to assert themselves, saying, "Dad, you're going too far. That hurts." And then the dad stops. So the child has a safe way in which she or he can say to dad, "No, that's too much. That's hurting. That's crying." But the fathers tend to sort of walk a very fine line between pushing the child too far and yet providing a safety mechanism for the child. So when they're wrestling, most fathers have a very good instinct of letting the child win when she or he really tries hard, and letting the child lose. And sometimes when the child loses, the child will cry, the child will stomp off, and the mothers will usually get very upset and say, "This just proves that that you can't and shouldn't be playing with the child. You're not providing the safety for the child. Look, you made the child cry." For the father, this is a stepping stone to mature masculinity and also to mature femininity. What we find is that children do better with the more father involvement they have, up to about an equal amount with the mother. And it's not just boy children, it's also girl children. So for example, with girl children, the more involvement the child has with the father, the less likely that girl is to get pregnant. And especially get pregnant out of wedlock is what I mean, and especially much less likely to get pregnant as a teenager. She's more likely to be, if she doesn't have father involvement that's significant, she's more likely to be promiscuous very quickly, and not because she feels sexual, but because she has to do that to please the man, because she doesn't have other more subtle ways of being able to please men that are not just being sexual. Or alternatively, she's so fearful of men, she's not able to be sexual when she is in love. She's not able to know how to love a man. And so these are some of the examples of how it's not only important for boys to have fathers, but also for girls. But the introduction to mature masculinity also happens with seeing when you're a boy. And if you look at your life as a father, a potential father, and you see that your father is divorced and not able, and is fighting, having a battle to just be able to be involved with you, and is living in some apartment somewhere and is depressed, that is, or he's fairly successful economically, but his money is being taken from him, but he's not doing what he wants to economically. He's selling product X that he doesn't believe in. Well, you look at that as a boy and you see that and you say, is that what I want to be? Is that what my life wants to be? So while the importance of fathers is great for girls and boys, it has a little bit of a more of an edge for boys, because the boys see in their father who they can be and who they can't be, and they see the hopelessness. And when they feel that hopelessness, they often turn to things like video games, and because that's one place that they can win. But the neuroscience of video games is that video games, for example, are very good for children for a small amount of time. But after a while, if the child gets so that it's not coming to dinner because it needs to finish the video game, not doing homework because it needs to finish the video game, that's the sign of what I call VGA, video game addiction. And the video game addiction means that the part of your brain, the nucleus accumbens, it has a lot of dopamine that's fed to it when you win the video game. So you keep trying to win the video game to get the dopamine that's in the nucleus accumbens part of the brain. But what very few people know is that it shuts off the part of the boy's brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that is responsible for translating something that you're doing in theory, like a video game, into action. So boys can win in NFL Madden football in a video game, but never even play football in real life. And it's because they're afraid to go out there and take the risks in real life. And so part of what makes boys so effective in the world is the ability to translate something that they learn into real life activity. And when boys are addicted to video games, that part of the brain that learns how to translate things into real life activity, that part of the brain is shut off. And so these are all things that inhibit the entrance to mature masculinity, and this is only the tip of the iceberg of 31 different areas where the entrance to mature masculinity is significantly assisted and abetted by the involvement of fathers, and not just fathers alone, but fathers and mothers working in tension with each other. Mothers saying things like, no, the child shouldn't climb the tree, and dad saying, yes, the child should climb the tree. And the tension between the mother and the father as to whether the child should climb the tree is actually good for the outcome of the child, where the child will get more protection than she or he would have gotten without the mother, and more encouragement to take risks than the child would have gotten without the father. And so a lot of things that we feel are bad fathering or bad mothering, a lot of those problems are solved by fathers and mothers having approximately an equal amount of power and involvement with the children.
Yeah, I heard something the other day about fathers who throw their children up in the air, and how they've now found that this whole behavior of fathers throwing the kids up in the air, of course, most fathers do this automatically. They don't even think about it. They throw the kids up, and the kids love it. And the mother's going, oh my God, put the child down. But they found out now that the kids who get thrown in the air by their fathers have an easier time taking risks later in life. Mm-hmm. Isn't that fascinating? There's all kinds of little behaviors like that fathers do automatically that are shamed now. Nothing wrong with him for thinking about doing that. That actually are good for kids.
And they're more likely to be trusting of strangers when they've had behavior like that occur, because there's not a fear that the moment something is different and you're thrown, that you're gonna fall and hurt yourself.
Yeah.
And very similar to that, Tom, is very often when you have a mom and dad with a child, and a father will use words that the child doesn't know, and the mother will think that that's really insensitive. Like, that, you know that Jimmy doesn't know or Jane doesn't know those words, so why are you using them? And the father's answer is, I want to plant seeds. I want to be able to set your languages learned by words that you haven't heard before and absorbing them. Well, now we have the data to know that when fathers are around and they're doing that type of behavior, and understand that mothers can also do that same behavior should they wish to, that the child learns to be a more effective and fluent reader and speaker and writer than she or he does without that type of stimuli. So, but the problem is that no one is saying this to the education community except people like Michael Gurian and and Leonard Sachs, but a few of them at least are having certain things that they're saying boys think differently, and whether we agree with their data or not, at least it's at least a different view of the potential contribution of boys, of adult males to the school system and to the socialization process, I think, is being introduced.
Yeah, but even when we do say something to the schools, they don't listen. You say something to legislators, they don't listen. Maybe the alphabet curtain,
This is where Paul's thing comes into. We have to speak up whether they listen or not.
Well, there you go.
And we have to make it uncomfortable whether they like it or not.
Yes, exactly right.
I'll never forget the first time I picked up a copy, Women Can't Hear What Men Don't Say, and I thought, well, of course, you do need to say it. I was, as you both were talking, I was remembering, and this is, of course, anecdotal, but my experience with friends growing up, and particularly what I've seen in parenting styles now, that I think fathers have traditionally given their children, was something that my father gave me, which was a sense of accountability. That if I gave my word to something, or if I had a responsibility, it wasn't a negotiation with my father. I could turn it into one with my mother. But with my father, there was your word, and there was not your word.
Yeah.
And not your word wasn't an option. And he was very good about holding your feet to the fire, that if this is what you commit to, this is what you do. So be careful what you commit to. And he would teach instructive lessons like that, and lessons about values. I remember him telling me over and over again in life that if you can leave your values at the door, you did not have them to begin with. I wanted to also address something that Warren talked about, the different styles in delivering this message. I also want to point out, for the sake of clarity, that if anybody thinks that Warren Farrell has obsessed on whether or not what he says, I would suggest picking up a couple of his books and reading them, because you're going to read a lot of stuff that people have taken objection to for years. I agree with him. There isn't a bit of contradiction between what people like Warren and Tom and I do, each in our different ways, and the many other ways that other people operate in getting this across. I think the only important thing really is that they speak and find their own voice in a way that's comfortable for them, or that works for them, or where they're most successful, and that they pursue that with an understanding of the actual stakes that are here. Because we're not talking, and I've said this before, I'll say it 1,000 more times, this is a very serious game, what's happening with sexual politics now, what's happening with our boys. The consequences for a culture of lost boys are very, very dire. That is, you don't want to live in that world. I can't imagine anybody wanting to live in a world where there was nothing but errant masculinity of rudderless, angry men going about. Because I will say, feminists talk all the time about toxic masculinity. I don't really believe they know what it is, because I believe that so many of them don't understand healthy masculinity and what it's about. They understand masculinity should be turned into femininity. But what they really don't get is that strong, valued, mature masculinity has been the backbone of civilization in so many ways, and is what keeps law and order in our culture as much as we're able to have it, even though there will always be a criminal element. This is what masculinity is about and always has been, and now we're faced with that going down the drain. And I promise you, I fear for the lives of my grandchildren, my grandsons, of what kind of world they could be in 20, 30 years from now. Because if things continue the way they're going, I think we've got a very, very hard road ahead of us.
I agree.
Part of masculinity is loving women, and so oftentimes feminists look at men, and they say that we manipulated the world in a hierarchical type of way to sort of put women down and have things at our own to our benefit, and not to women's benefits. And at the same time, we have a male-only draft registration. We have all these rules that are set up to, we have, if men were creating the rules to benefit men, they would want women to be sexual with them all the time. They would want, they would not be repressing women's sexuality. They would be opening women's sexuality, making it frequent and flowing. But there would also be, you also hear a great deal of criticism about hierarchies. The males are very into competing with each other and being hierarchical. Yes, masculinity and hierarchy were associated with each other, but they were associated with each other primarily for the exact reason that that Paul was just talking about, which is the reason of accountability. When you're a private in the Army, you don't have to have any accountability. And then you learn, you're criticized by the sergeant and you're put down, and you learn to handle criticism. And then if you can get beyond being criticized for whatever you are and whoever you are, and not take yourself so seriously and be willing to be disposable, you then start maybe taking risks, like you're willing to protect somebody else in war, you're willing to invade a certain place, you're willing to learn something, a skill set that's very important and very needed, whether or not you like it or not. And if you do that and do that successfully, you're promoted. Each level in which you're promoted, you either risked more disposability, or you were accountable for achieving something that wasn't achieved by the people below you. And so what the word hierarchy is used as a dirty word, if instead of that you think accountability is part of what men really made crucial to the development of mature masculinity, then you get a different view of some of the positive dimensions of what men taught each other and what men learned. Women had responsibility to raise children, but they didn't raise children well in a world where there was no divorces allowed, and there was no one to fire them. Without divorces, she had her source of income, whether or not she took that responsibility effectively and honestly and well and fully, or whether she didn't. Most women fulfilled enormous amount of responsibilities, but they didn't have to, because the lack of being able to be divorced for thousands of years protected them from being fired for that from their job, their source of income. And so there was more voluntary accountability. There was voluntary responsibility for women, but accountability is different than responsibility. Accountability says that you in order to get anywhere, in order to have a nice home, the man had to succeed at work and be accountable at each level of success. For the woman to raise the children at home, as long as she was married to him, she could have a nicer and nicer home by just existing in that home as a mother without necessarily being accountable. And so we have taught accountability differently to boys and to girls and to men than to women, but by calling it things like hierarchy and having a pejorative association with that, we haven't seen the value of the contributions that traditional masculinity has made to boys and to men.
Yeah, I'm with you, Warren. I think that hierarchy actually has done a great deal for men and for the world. And boys and men still have this hierarchy thing going. I mean, if you look at gaming, for instance, it's all about hierarchy. I'm
Yes.
going to get to level 17. I'm going to get to level 17. This is hierarchy. This is actually a good thing. In fact, gaming is one of the two places that's left where masculinity exists, really. I mean, gaming, you compete, you try hard, and you get something because you've competed.
Yes.
And you can cuss, you can scream, you can tell someone to screw off, you can do whatever. It's a very masculine space. You know, you do it well, you're going to get promoted. You don't do it well, you're going to sink.
Yes.
Sports is the other arena where masculinity still has some sway. But other than that, I think we're out of gas.
And both of those areas, Tom, I note, are under attack right now by
Exactly. Exactly right. Both. And because those are the last bastions of the masculine. You know, we've been talking a lot about mature masculine tonight. I don't know if you all are familiar with the writings of a guy named Robert Moore. He wrote a series of books, 5 books on the masculine archetypes.
I missed the last name. There was some noise in the office. What
That's
was it?
Robert Moore, Moore.
Oh, yes.
A 5-book series on the masculine archetypes, and throughout the series he talks about, well, what is this mature masculine and what is the immature masculine? And it's fascinating stuff. And for people who are interested, the first book in the series is a summation of the 5 books. It's called The King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, I think is the title. Yeah. And it's well worth reading if you're curious about the mature masculine and what that's all about.
Absolutely. Yes, and Robert Bly is also very good on those issues as well.
Good old Bly, from a poet's perspective, yeah.
And I think we've promised our listeners that we would keep this to about an hour, so maybe we should begin to close.
Paul, you watching the time?
Yeah, I think we're pretty close. I just wanted to toss in one thing, and final say for the night. I've enjoyed this conversation a tremendous amount.
Yeah.
You know, all this culminates, and I'm always thinking now in terms of our next conference on men's issues. And our next one is going to be themed. We're going to have topics related to our mission statement, but the overall theme, and I believe Warren was right, and I know that some men in the movement will disagree with me, but I do think it is in men's nature to love women. I think it is in human nature to pair bond. It's pretty obvious to me that that's not an arguable point, given the propensity for human beings to pair bond, as a matter of fact, throughout history. And I think that things have gone awry in that bonding in the last 40, 50 years, that they've really gone awry because what we've had is, at least superficially, there has been a change for women in their roles. I personally think it's a great thing. I don't think any human being should be held back from their potential or their desires based on their genitals. That to me seems thinking that is really, really archaic.
Yes.
But what we've ended up with is a culture that says we can place no limits on women, but here we're still going to confine men to, you can't express anger towards women, you can't do this, you can't do that, you must do this, you've got to do that. Oh, do we have an echo happening here?
You sound okay. You're a little muffled, but you sound okay.
I think it was a hierarchical decision on the part of the video. Your voice is twice as much as would be
by the software. But I think what we have to start getting, if we're ever going to fix this stuff, a lot of it will come back to the connection between men and women, to the social contract, the social expectation in women, because that's where everything is rooted, in my opinion. That we are going to have a transition that means building bridges between men and women again, because so many of them have been torn down and burned down. But these bridges are not going to be bridges that are just built on the backs of men. It's going to mean women getting their hands blistered right alongside us. And if you look at it, to me, correctly, it fulfills everything that feminism promised, but never delivered, and is to have that sense of parity with each other, that respect is commanded based on actions and character and values, and not on genitalia, and not on your born status and privilege, and that we need men and women working together to build those bridges together, or they will not stand, because we can't have a culture of the entitled and the ones that are still chained to a gender role. It has to be a choice, and conscious choices, we can get into that, a whole nother discussion, because I believe that traditional relationships can work if people are conscious of what they're doing, and they both dedicate to those ground rules. But we do need to have, I think, a change of attitude in this culture where we get men off of their white horses and get women off their pedestals and start seeing each other as human beings with equal rights and equal responsibilities. If we can do that somewhere, I believe the stuff about boys may well fall into place. But I think we've got a long way to go. And that's it for me tonight.
Sounds like a good ending. Warren, last words?
I'm fine. I just think it's been a really good discussion.
Yes, I agree. It's been a good discussion. I've really enjoyed hearing both Warren and Paul tonight. And thank you all for joining us. It's been an enjoyable time with you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next Thursday at the same time. And keep in mind that MANstream Media is a place to hear the male-friendly side of things, whether it's the issues or the news. And with that, good night.